apologies for my rather weak Italian, so I'll have to speak in English. Thank you everyone for the kind invitation to be with you in today's conference. And such is the world, 1 year ago, we were all sort of like going into a first lockdown, but now I think we've all adjusted and are able to work virtually and communicate and share ideas virtually. As mentioned, I lead PwC's cities and local government work globally, including smart cities. I'm also part of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Cities of Tomorrow. And what I would like to do is, in the coming 20 minutes or so, share with you some of our thinking, some of our observations on how COVID has changed cities, smart cities around the world, and what do we see happening next. The starting point, if we were to establish a baseline, is the ambition that a lot of cities have worldwide to become really the best places, the engine of growth, offer quality of life, inclusive growth, and so forth. So about a few years ago, we asked 200 of the top urbanists, city planners, from all academics from all over the world, what is it that they believe are the most important characteristics for future successful cities? And these 8 characteristics were all agreed on by the group of experts we surveyed. They have to be sustainable. And with sustainable, it's not just environmentally, but economically and social. They have to be citizen-centric. They have to be economically vibrant in terms of offering what really makes cities the engines of innovation and growth that they are. They have to be accessible, and not just for the handicapped, but for the elderly, for the children, and for anybody who lives or visits the city. They have to be resilient, and the resilience has really come into a very new definition and shape in the past couple of years, right? And we will take a double click and focus on this. They have to be well governed in terms of the relationship between the city departments and also between the city department or the city hall, the mayor's team, also the government at the national level and also at the regional level. They have to be innovative. We hear a lot about urban cities being, living labs, a place where we can pilot ideas and innovations. And most importantly, they have to be very well planned, not only in terms of urban planning, but also in terms of financial planning. So given all of these ambitions, and if we start to look back at the last 20 years, you see that the frequency and the type of natural and man-made disasters are increasing. So the new normal means that a city has to be ready and resilient to be able to face a lot more of these threats. So we, almost in 2005, 2006, we had SARS, tsunamis, but unfortunately, and I hate to be, the bearer of a negative message, if there is one thing that we can observe from the past few years is that the frequency and the impact and the intensity of these natural and man-made disasters are going to happen more frequently, and they're going to have higher socioeconomic impact in cities. And therefore, we need to be thinking about how do we make our cities more resilient. And we've seen this very much in the case of COVID-19, that those cities and regions and countries that have invested in their digital connectivity and platforms have really fared much better than those who have not done so. And we will share with you some of these examples. The same reasons that make cities what they are in terms of being, the centers of growth with high density, reliance on public transport, concentration of economic activities. A lot of cities are also national, regional, or global economic and travel hubs. Those same reasons, we see that in different phases of the pandemic. And what we've done here is a very interesting analysis that we've looked at many cities around the world, capitals and centers of commerce. And we've looked at 3 statistics, basically. One, what is the percentage of that city of the national population? And then we look at two snapshots, one of them in April 20 and the other one in March 21. What percentage of the total reported COVID cases basically does this city account for? And we've seen, and that in general, it varies, of course, from some cities to the other. Two things are true from this analysis. One, initially, most of the cities have had a disproportionate percentage of cases, again, because of all of the reasons that I mentioned. And over time, as cities started to get their act together and to really put in place the policies and the regulations and to manage the situation, be it in terms of economic activities, lockdowns, vaccinations, and all of that, they tend to trend towards the number that we would expect, which is the percentage of the population. And even in some cases, they've done better and managed to reduce below that. Now, the challenge that cities had to experience is what I call the twin challenge. How do you actually flatten the infection curve, but at the same time, making sure that you don't have recession going up? And that is really the challenge that a lot of mayors around the world have to deal with in the past 15 months or so. So how do you make policies about lockdown and confinement, travel and tourism restrictions, not only at a national level, but also sometimes globally? Also, how do you provide subsidies to the population? How do you provide stimulus packages? Sometimes, the ability even to identify who are the people eligible and to distribute all of these networks of economic and social support has become difficult in some cities that didn't have in place the right databases, the right analytics, and the right methods actually to make sure that there is distribution. Earlier in the pandemic, there were some issues about food security. There were issues about even deep inequality. When we've done analysis on what were some of the parts of the society that got impacted more, women got disproportionately impacted by COVID. Those groups that actually were already at the poverty level or below the average income got disproportionately impacted. And then when you see how this sort of impact manifests itself in terms of different economic sectors, real estate, transportation, tourism and hospitality, and healthcare came under a lot of pressure and had a lot of negative impact. Maybe the one exception is sector is telecom, media, and technology that really had seen a positive impact because higher reliance on connectivity and so forth. But also, there is always a silver lining in any crisis. And we've seen a lot of very good innovations coming out of cities and acceleration of innovations that they were thinking about due to COVID. And I will just talk about certain areas here that we've seen in several cities. So we've seen a much better use of advanced data and analytics, basically, to be able, such as in South Korea, to do contact tracing, to be able to really track the spread of the disease and to start really taking informed policy decisions based on that. We've seen a lot of cities put together crisis management assets and sort of like crisis rooms, and a lot of these learnings I think will continue on to future incidents and situations and crises that the cities would face. We've seen digital education, digital remote working pick up like nothing else, and we've also seen cashless transactions also pick up in many cities. There is also a lot of things that are starting to happen with respect to some future adoption of future and emerging technologies. So some cities are really thinking about accelerating some of their 5G electric vehicles, also using digital twins to simulate cities' behavior under different situations and scenarios, and also public and health education capacity augmentation, through augmented reality and virtual reality. So in other words, this crisis has really accelerated the use and the adoption of digital technologies and thinking about really how to better prepare for the next crisis. Now, prior to COVID, there has already been a substantial gap in terms of investment and funding of infrastructure, including digital infrastructure. And depending on who you ask, whether the World Bank and others, these estimates are actually expected to be about $15 trillion by 2040. And then over the next 15 years, at least 400 billion will be used or needed every year to make city infrastructure green and more resilient, and that includes also digital infrastructure and connectivity, as I mentioned. So the gap in this funding is huge. What we've done last year, there's something called the Urban 20, which is the city engagements group under the G20. And this year, Italy is actually the president of the G20 in 2021. Last year, it was Saudi Arabia. And this year, the Urban 20 is co-hosted by the cities of Milan and Roma. And last year, what we've done is under the Urban 20, we've done a survey where we've asked in June 2020, 21 cities, you see the logos here on the left-hand side of the slide, including the city of Rome and many other European cities and from all over the world, both developed and emerging economies. Population of over 75 million inhabitants. And I will share with you some of these findings because some of them are quite interested in terms of digital connectivity and the ability to fund them. So again, re-emphasizing what I mentioned before, no budget and access to national government stimulus packages for emergency situations. So a lot of these, the national government funding was for business as usual. And then when COVID happened, the situation and the access to those emergency funds did not happen at the pace that the city really required to be able to deal with their problems at the local level. In many parts of the world, maybe there is a dependence on international finance, be it through the multilateral development banks or the World Bank, even the European Reconstruction and Development Bank in some situations. And that funding didn't come early enough and quickly enough. And the very important point about a limited engagement with the private sector, and as I heard in the opening speech from the president, the private sector really has to play a very important role in this. So what are some of the highlights of the survey findings? We grouped here into three types of services. Services that were disrupted and entirely available for long periods of time. At 80% almost, we had arts and culture, followed by public spaces, parks, and recreation, 50%. The middle column is services that were partially disrupted or the quality decreased, such as public transportation, care services, education. And on the right-hand side, those services that were delivered as usual throughout the outbreak, mostly utilities, so such as water, safety, water and energy, policing, fire, and also e-services, 75%. So again, a very important message when we talk about smart communities and smart cities. This is no longer a luxury. This becomes part of critical services, the same way we look at utilities, policing, and many other critical services. In terms of some of the challenges faced by the cities in terms of providing the urban services, the biggest challenge was also obviously revenue loss due to reduced taxes or income from services, social distancing policies and their impact on the economy, increased operational expenses, and supply chain disruptions. Interestingly enough, when we looked also on the impact on cities' budgets, both capital expenditures and operating budgets, in the operating budgets case, around 92% actually had to reduce their budgets. Only 8% of the cities that we surveyed basically, didn't experience a deficit. And 12% actually of the cities only had their capital budget projects not affected, and the rest of obviously have had to either reprioritize, put on hold, or cancel projects. When we asked them about the recovery moving forward, what would the investments look like post-COVID? Number one on a scale of 1 to 5 at 4.5 is more investment in digital and broadband infrastructure, followed by transport and utilities. And when we ask them about the criteria they're going to use to prioritize these investments, the number one criteria was positive impact on the local economy, followed by, at 4.5 out of 5, building back better and improvement of public services, and additional redundancies and so forth. So that becomes a very important message in terms of how are we going to plan for the next crisis, and what is it that we should be doing differently to be better prepared. A framework here that we've used to basically test cities' resilience and to provide some messaging as PwC. We looked at basically the 3 urban domains, nothing new here: urban society, environment, and economy. We looked at the enablers: urban innovations and technology, capacity and governance, finance and investment. And most importantly, we looked at this through what we call the threat management life cycle. So it's no longer good to be starting this cycle by defending and responding and recovering from a crisis. You really have to start earlier, and this is the sensing phase, where you're accurately predicting threats using data analytics and other tools, and constantly really previewing and preparing for these threats. So it's very important when we think about resilience and smart cities and the role of digital technology that we really focus on that sensing phase. Another important thing you see here in the bottom, that this is not something that a city can do alone. It has to be done with the key stakeholders, the citizens, the government at multiple levels: national, regional, and within the city departments, the private sector, NGOs, and academia. And we've looked at 5 specific cities that actually have been very successful in their response, and we've looked at how they've done this using technology in collaboration with the private sector in different stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. A quote here by my good friend Jan Pavapuri, who is the mayor in the city of Stockholm. And the city of Stockholm here really looks at 3 pillars, and they were one of the very few cities that had very little economic impact on them. So they look at smart city, they look at inclusive city, and sustainable city. And everything that they drive, the city's mission is to be the most functional city in the world. And it's based on a holistic leadership model where they work with all the other stakeholders. Boston, with academia also and the private sector, did some very interesting data analytics and ability to really recover and to start distributing supplies, especially to medical workers, very early on. Riyadh, here in the Middle East, where I actually live in Dubai, we're able basically to use a lot of apps. So when you arrive into the city, you take your PCR, you test, you do contact tracing, and through the app, they check if you're really compliant with this, and you're able to use all of these apps basically to keep tracking of who's vaccinated, who has actually been tested, and so forth. Singapore worked very closely with its citizens in making sure that also they are part of the response, abiding with social distancing. And Vienna also used technology in very interesting ways also to open up its economy, especially for the small establishments. In terms of some of the things that cities need to do in the first 100 days of a crisis, basically, and how to respond. First, and this is based on our research and a lot of work that we've done with these cities around the world. First of all, there has to be a very clear fact-based communication and engagement with the citizens and the key stakeholders. There has to be alternative emergency funding options beyond the central government sources. One of the things that are going to be discussed is an urban emergency resilience fund. This was actually discussed under the G20 and the Urban 20 last year, and those conversations under the Italian presidency will continue this year. More relevant to this specific conference is the identification of technology and service continuity gaps and building the effective monitoring and safeguarding operations. Again, continuing the notion of using technology as a key enabler throughout the threat management cycle, and especially during the sensing phase. And most importantly, integrated governance and crisis management control for early warning, analysis, and threats, and continued response. I have a lot to tell you more, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll stop here at this point. Grazie mille, and enjoy your conference, and thank you again for the kind invitation.